But I said, there may be two things we always disagree on. He looked up from the table and said, what? And I said, well, I referred to our differences about my role on January 6th. And then I looked at him and said, and I'm never going to stop praying for you. And he looked up with a faint smile and said, that's right. Don't ever change.
Let's talk about your relationship with former President Trump. You two were the best of friends, an incredibly dynamic political duo. It's my view that he couldn't have been elected, actually, if you hadn't helped persuade a rather large number of wavering evangelicals, myself included, to get fully behind him, to stop Hillary Clinton and go with the promises that he and you had made on the campaign trail. Do you have a relationship with him anymore? Where do things stand?
Well, I couldn't be more proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. And as I capture in my book, So Help Me God, we had not only a successful working relationship, but a close working relationship. I spent hours every day in the Oval Office when we were both at the White House. We spoke every day by phone when we were traveling, one or the other. And I'm grateful for the opportunities the president gave me to participate in efforts on Capitol Hill, to pass historic tax relief, to travel around the world and represent the United States, to travel around the country in vital moments. And I mean, obviously, the administration did not end well. And I'll always believe that on that day in January of 2021, that we did our duty under the Constitution of the United States. But as you'll read in the final pages of that book, the president and I, we found a way to part amicably. But in the days following our departure from office, I saw the president return to some of the same rhetoric that he was using in the lead up to January 6th.
Mike Pence had a chance to be great. He had a chance to be, frankly, historic. But Mike did not have the courage to act.
I just thought it was best for us to go our separate ways, and we have. But as I said, I'll always believe that we did our duty under the Constitution of the United States that day, and I'll always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration, and I'll never stop fighting to advance those same ideals across this nation and on behalf of America for the rest of my days.
Well, you're very respectful, in my view, of the president in the book. And you give him, enormous credit, obviously. But you wrote very candidly in the book about what happened leading up to and on and right after January 6th. And I want to ask you this. Let's just say it again on the record. I mean, I know you've said it on other networks, but why didn't you accept President Trump's argument?
Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country, because you're sworn to uphold our Constitution.
And with that, I just have to ask you, I'm curious, did you ever have the conversation with him did you ever ask him that in 2000, did he believe that Vice President Al Gore had the authority to certify himself as president rather than George W. Bush, despite the votes and the Supreme Court decision?
Well, look, 2020 was a challenging year for the American people and the world with the worst pandemic in 100 years. And while we got 10 million more votes than we had gotten 4 years earlier, there was great concern among the American people that I shared that in the name of COVID, a half a dozen states had literally changed the rules for voting and mail-in voting and early voting without, in many cases, going to their legislatures. And those voting irregularities were real, although the evidence of widespread voter fraud would never emerge. But I thought it was appropriate for the campaign that we had run to go to the courts to raise those issues. That's what the courts are for, to review those irregularities. But somewhere along the way, as those court decisions were being resolved, there emerged a theory largely on the internet that as vice president, in my role as the presiding officer at the joint session of Congress where the Electoral College votes are counted, that I possess some unilateral authority to reject votes or return votes back to the states. You know, it's an important principle in the Constitution that states conduct our elections. And the only thing Congress does under the Constitution is open and count the votes that are certified by the states, no more and no less. But along the way, the president became surrounded by advisors that were telling him that I had the authority to overturn the election. But President Trump was wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. No vice president in American history had ever asserted that authority. And frankly, Joel, the idea that any one person could choose the American president, I think, was actually un-American. The presidency belongs to the American people and to the American people alone. And I was determined to fulfill my duty before the Congress of the United States to do just that. And thanks to law enforcement's efforts, the riot that day on January 6th was quelled. And that day of tragedy, I believe, became a triumph of freedom, because as the world watched, we reconvened the Congress of the United States on the very same day and conducted the peaceful transfer of power under the Constitution of the United States. The joint session of Congress to count the electoral vote will resume. The chair declares the joint session dissolved. For me, ultimately, it was a triumph of freedom. But my duty in that day was always clear to me, and that was simply to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
You said at some point there's a telephone conversation between the president and the vice president. Is that correct?
When I entered the office the second time, he was on the telephone with who I later found out to be was the vice president.
Started off as a calmer tone and everything, and then became heated.
The conversation was pretty heated.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what did you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, "You are a wimp, you'll be a wimp." Wimp is the word I remember.
It's also been reported that the president said to the vice president that something to the effect of, "You don't have the courage to make a hard decision."
Worse, I don't remember exactly either, but something like that.
I hear the Pence just caved. I'm telling you, if Pence caved, we're going to drag through the streets.
Bring out Pence!
Bring it on!
Bring out Pence!
Take the building, hold.
So if we're going to leave, we need to do it now.
They've gained access to the second floor.
Clear, we're coming out now, all right? Make a way.
How close did you and Karen and your daughter Charlotte, who was with you as well, how close did you come to actually being lynched or in other ways killed by that mob on January 6th?
You know, I've read the reports. I remember when they evacuated me off the floor of the Senate, the first thing Secret Service told me was that we needed to get you out of the building. But I was determined to stay at my post. You know, I felt that I had a duty to stay at the Capitol. And first we went to my personal office off the Senate floor. But when Secret Service came in, and as I write in my book, they told me again that we needed to leave the building. I looked at my lead Secret Service agent, I put my finger in his chest, and I said, "You're not hearing me. I'm not leaving." I said, "I'm not going to give those people the sight of a 16-car motorcade pulling away from the Capitol." You know, I was determined to stay, to do our duty, to do our job. By God's grace, we were able to do that. But they did require us to leave that office. They said that that floor of the Capitol had been compromised by the rioters. Treason! 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 And so we moved down to what essentially was a loading dock beneath the Capitol, and it was there that we would remain. I made calls to the congressional leadership, made calls to leadership at the Justice Department and the Pentagon to facilitate and to encourage a proper response. But I must tell you that that through it all, and again, I say this very sincerely, by God's grace, I had a deep, settled sense of our duty that day, and was determined to finish our work, which we were able to do. And I do believe that as I've traveled across the country in the last 2 years, that the vast majority of Americans understand that whatever they may have thought about those voting irregularities, at the end of the day, we did our duty under the Constitution.
When you finally got back to the White House, though, you describe a 90-minute meeting, a tense meeting with the president. Would you take us inside that room and tell us what happened? Because I think at one point you said, I just want you to know, Mr. President, I'm praying for you. We don't agree on everything, and he said, don't bother. Tell us what happened there.
I was very direct with the president. He first asked after my wife and daughter, who literally were with me all night long on January the 6th and to the early hours of the morning on January 7th. He asked after them. I told him they were fine. And he looked at me and said, were you scared? And I said, no, I was angry. I was angry about the difference he and I had. I made clear, and I also said I was angry at what I saw people doing at the Capitol building, because I thought it dishonored the tens of millions of people across this country who had supported our administration and our campaigns, who would never have done anything like that there or anywhere else. But we sat down and we spoke, and we aired out our differences. I was very clear and very candid with the president. But in that moment and in a few subsequent meetings before we would leave Washington, D.C. on January 20th, I encouraged the president to pray. I told him I was praying for him. In fact, in one of our final meetings, I looked at the president as I was walking out of the small dining room, and I said, I told him, well, Mr. President, there may be two things that we never agree on, because I told him many times that I was praying for him, and he had been dismissive about it. But I said, there may be two things we always disagree on. He looked up from the table and said, what? And I said, well, I referred to our differences about my role on January 6th. And then I looked at him and said, and I'm never going to stop praying for you. And he looked up with a faint smile and said, that's right. Don't ever change. I mean, as you'll read in the pages of So Help Me God, despite the difficulties of the days leading up to January 6th and on that tragic day, the president and I, we parted amicably. We spoke from time to time after we left office. But again, as I said, when the president returned to some of the same rhetoric he was using leading up to that day, again, returning to criticizing my role, the stand that I'd taken, I just thought it was important that we go our separate ways, and we have.
One guy got up and said that he heard me calling Mike Pence a wimp. Now, in honesty, I'm the president of the United States. You know, I'm sitting, I think they said at my desk, he's a wimp. How many people listen to me? It's like, I don't even know who these people are. But I never called Mike Pence a wimp. I never called him a wimp.
I've kept firm in my conviction that we did the right thing that day, Joel, and I've always continued to pray for my old running mate and his family, and I always will.
I pray that there's a reconciliation there in due time. The Biden administration, the Biden Justice Department is now investigating the events of January 6th, and they've subpoenaed you to testify before a grand jury, as though you haven't spoken on every network and radio, newspaper that will listen. What happened? You're resisting that subpoena on constitutional grounds. Maybe a short version, but what's the short version of why?
Well, first, it would be unprecedented for a former vice president to be called into court to testify against the president with whom they served. And I appreciate the fact you've said I've not only written but spoken about the events of those days. I think the American people have a right to know what happened, and we'll continue to speak about those things. But beyond it being unprecedented, I do believe it's also unconstitutional.
Mr. Trump has obviously announced that he's running again. Nikki Haley has announced that she's running for president. Are you running for president? And let's face it, you talk about unprecedented. It would be unprecedented for a former vice president to challenge a former president that he served with in a primary battle. So are you doing it? And if so, or even if you're not ready to say yet, but what would be the central rationale of a Pence campaign? Because essentially, right, you're saying, I think that Mr. Trump is not the right person to return and that you should. So walk us through your thinking and your time frame, maybe.
Well, Karen and I are giving prayerful consideration to entering the race for president of the United States, and we'll have a decision, I think, sometime this spring. But, you know, I've often heard there's two kinds of people in politics, Joel. There's people that are driven and there's people that are called. And if you read my book, you'll find out I've been both. I've allowed my political ambition to get ahead of my values. But the last 20 years, my aspiration has been simply to respond to what we perceive to be God's calling in our life. And when I think about the great challenges facing this country, I do believe that 2024 will call forth a new style of leadership grounded in the same principles that the Trump-Pence administration advanced: a strong national defense, leader of the free world, a commitment to economic freedom, to energy independence, to secure borders, to conservatives on our courts at every level. But I also sense, traveling across the country, that people would like to see us return to a politics that reflects more of the civility and respect that the American people show each other every day. You know, I do believe that democracy depends on heavy doses of civility. And in both parties, we've gotten away from that of late. And because of my career and what people perceive to be my aspirations, as I write in the book, I sense that the American people long for that. People that worry about where the country is today, I tell them that we just got to have government as good as our people. As I said before, and that includes a government that treats one another the way they want to be treated, which is the way the American people deal with one another, with principle, but also with respect and civility every day. So that's what we're going to reflect on. The great challenges that our country faces, I think, call for experience. I've been blessed with serving in leadership in the Congress, leading a state as governor, serving as Vice President of the United States. And when we think about the rise of China, when we think about the great challenges that Israel faces today in the Middle East, challenges, threats from Iran, when we think about Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine, when we think about the rise of China, and we think about the challenges here at home, it seems to me to call for experience. So we're going to reflect on the experience that we have, and we're going to determine whether or not this is the moment that we feel called to step forward and offer our services to the American people. But Joel, I promise we'll keep you posted.
Okay, I appreciate it. Well, I'll close with just this one thought, and I appreciate this. I know you're a man of prayer. You and Karen is a woman of prayer, obviously in all your life, but particularly on these types of decisions. You and I, you had been here as governor of Indiana. You came to Jerusalem in around, I think it was December of probably 2015, or maybe it was 14, but I think it was 15. And you invited Lynn and I to come up and spend some time with you and your family in your hotel suite after you gave a speech. And we remember talking to you about, well, are you thinking of getting in? And you said, we've been praying about it, and we just don't sense that this is what God wants us to do. And so you asked us to be praying, and we did. And you didn't run, but ended up as Vice President of the United States. And so, you know, may God guide you as each of the candidates. May He keep you safe. And I got to close by saying, look, this is a great book. You may agree with Mike Pence, you may not, but you still have to read the book, because So Help Me God tells the story that nobody else can tell. It's a story of two men's convictions working together to advance so much good in this country, and then a total clash a vision and conviction and a view of the law, it'd make an interesting novel, except that it's true. And I think, and I commend you for being honest and candid about the way you have seen things. And I think history will, let people sort things out as what they think, but it's important that we know what you think and how you saw that. So congratulations on the book. I loved it. I commend it to everybody in my audience. You should read it. You should understand this. Whether Pence runs again or not, this was a critical moment in history. And I think we're all still trying to fully understand it and figure out its implications. So thank you, Mr. Vice President, for writing a great book and one that didn't pull any punches.
Well, Joel, thank you. Thanks for having me on. And coming from you with your matchless pen, it means a great deal to me. But I hope at the end of the day, people will grab a copy of So Help Me God, and I hope they'll be encouraged. The last few lines of the book, I say that my faith in God, my faith in the American people is boundless. And I know that when we return to those timeless principles, as I know we will, that the best days for the greatest nation on earth and our most cherished ally, Israel, are yet to come. Thank you, Joel.
Well, that's our show for tonight, and I hope that you enjoy both parts of the interview, this exclusive interview with Mike Pence. He was candid and somewhat controversial, especially if you disagree with him. But I encourage you to read the book. I encourage you to be praying for Pence and his family, for Donald Trump and his family, and of course, for President Biden and his family and advisors. We're commanded to pray for our leaders, and so we should. Make sure you check out our YouTube channel. Go to rosenbergreport.tv to sign up for our free email alerts. And Lord willing, I'll see you next week right here on the Rosenberg Report.